as a new era begins. A once dominant force falls behind the competition. A new console is conceived. But is it too late to succeed in the competitive 16-bit market? Let's take a look at the Super Nintendo.
What's up, guys, and welcome back to another Look At. And in today's episode of A Look At, we're going to take a look at that console right there, the Super Nintendo. We'll be taking a look at the history of the console, what's inside of it, what makes it tick. We'll do a 360 tour of the console, just showing where all the buttons are and where you plug in the cables and where the cartridge port is and all that kind of stuff. And then we'll go ahead and power it on and do some gameplay. At the very end of the video, I always give my thoughts and opinions, just telling you how I thought about the system way back in the 1990s. And also, in between each segment, I always put commercials in, just showing how the system was marketed back in the day. So without further ado, guys, let's go ahead and take a look.
Words can't describe the endless challenge of Super Mario World, so we let the players do the talking. Super Mario World is here. It's one of the new generation of Nintendo games. It comes only with Super Nintendo, and it's like nothing you've ever faced. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
The story of the SNES starts in 1987. A newcomer to the gaming industry, NEC, had just released the 16-bit PC engine in Japan. Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, had seen NEC and its product as a strong competitor to the NES, which started to worry Nintendo. At this point, sales of the NES were still great, but Yamauchi knew this would not last long with the great graphics and sound that the PC engine was able to produce. Also in 1987, it was announced that Sega was about to launch their 16-bit system, the Mega Drive. In September of 1987, Nintendo announced the development of the Super Famicom and a new Super Mario Bros. 4 game. The system was being developed by none other than Masayuki Uemura, who had developed the NES. Nintendo at this time was worried more about the NEC than Sega. The reason for this is that Sega had released a few consoles in the 8-bit era, but were completely overshadowed by the Famicom and the NES. Nintendo was really not in a hurry to develop the new 16-bit system because sales of the NES were still going good. However, this did not last long. Some feel Nintendo made this announcement in 1987 to stall sales of the PC engine during the Christmas season. In 1988, Sega released the Mega Drive, and the PC engine was picking up steam as well. NES sales started to slump, and Nintendo knew they had to get a new system on the market. Development went into full swing. But since Nintendo was so late to the game, it took a couple years to develop. The first prototypes of the system were shown to the public in 1988, and again before its launch in Japan in 1989. In 1989, both Sega and NEC had released their systems in North America, but changed the names to TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis. By the time the Super Famicom was ready to be launched, Sega was starting to take a lead in the gaming industry. With a good amount of games in its library, NEC was no slouch either. Nintendo, for the first time, had to deal with true competition. This marked one of the greatest console wars in history, Sega versus Nintendo. Nintendo released the Super Famicom in 1990 in Japan, and it instantly sold out of the 300,000 units that were made. The system was then released in North America under the name Super Nintendo in 1991. Also around this time, Nintendo was aware of the CD add-on that Sega was about to release and wanted one for their own Super NES system, so it could stay competitive. They had contracted out with Sony to develop the CD add-on named, you guessed it, the PlayStation. However, during the CES show in 1991, Nintendo reneged on their deal with Sony to produce it and went with Philips. Possibly one of the worst mistakes Nintendo ever made, birthing a monster in the gaming industry to this day, Sony's PlayStation. Philips went on to develop the CDI when Nintendo discontinued the CD add-on, but Philips still had a contract with Nintendo. This is why we have those weird CDI Zelda and Mario games like Hotel Mario and Zelda's Adventure. Once again, Nintendo had a lot of publishers developing for it, and unlike the Genesis, the games could be enhanced with special chips in the carts for sound and graphics. Also, it was capable of pseudo 3D graphics. During this time, sales of the system skyrocketed. As most older gamers used the Genesis, younger gamers chose the SNES. This was all part of the console war. This is a strategy that worked atop Sega then, but would not work on future consoles, as it was shown by Sony's marketing of the PS1 to older gamers in the market, while Nintendo was still marketing to kids with the N64. The SNES went on to sell just under 50 million units worldwide, being launched in 1990 in Japan and finally being discontinued in the UK in 2005, giving the system an amazing 15-year lifespan, making it one of the longest lasting game systems to ever hit the market.
Holy! Same graphics, same moves. It looks like the arcade, man.
Arcade, man.
16 bits.
16 bits.
All I can say is Killer Instinct only on Super NES, complete with Killer Cuts Game Music CD. It's totally uncensored. So who needs a new system?
Now let's take a look at what's inside the SNES and what makes it tick. The system had a few motherboard revisions over the years, with the latter boards integrating the CPU and PPUs onto a single chip to cut cost. But we'll only be discussing the motherboards that don't have the single integrated chip design, as it's easier to describe what each one does. But at the end of the segment, I will also show one of the newer motherboards as well. The first chip that we'll talk about is the CPU. The SNES has a Riot 5A22 CPU that is closely related to the WFC65C 816 CPU that is found in the Apple II GS, but is a 16-bit derivative of that chip. It is normally clocked at 3.58 MHz, but is capable of slowing down to either 2.68 MHz or 1.79 MHz to work with slower peripherals like, say, the Super Game Boy. It is a 16-bit chip that ran on an 8-bit data bus with two different address buses. Bus A, as it's known, was a 24-bit bus which ran the main system. Then there is Bus B that gives 8-bit access to support chips in the cartridges, such as the audio and video coprocessors. The next chips we'll talk about are the PPUs, or picture processing units. The SNES uses two PPUs that work together. Together they contain 64 KB of SRAM for video, 544 bytes of object attribute memory for sprite data. It can display 128 sprites on screen at once. Then there's the CRAM, or Color Generator RAM, at 256 by 15 bits, which can choose 256 colors of a color palette of 32,768 colors. The audio is provided by Sony's APU. This chip is an integrated design, having an 8-bit CPU, a 16-bit DSP, and 64K of SRAM. It was clocked at 24.56 MHz and was capable of producing stereo sound, combines 8 voices, and uses 8-bit audio sampling to produce effects. Next we'll look into the system RAM. The SNES had 128 KB of SRAM and 64 KB of VRAM for the sound and video subsystems. The last chip we'll look into is the lockout chip. This chip is very similar to the NES 10 chip that was found on the NES. It's a regional lockout chip along with a counterfeit lockout chip as well. Now let's take a look at this motherboard compared to the cost-reduced motherboard. As you can see, the newer board combines a lot of the ICs on the old board. The CPU, the PPUs have all been combined into one chip. Well, that about does it for this What's Inside. Nintendo came up with a pretty powerful machine for the time that could be expanded by the use of custom audio and video coprocessors in the cartridges, not unlike what Atari attempted to do with the 7800, unfortunately unsuccessfully.
This time, it calls you to the ultimate battle of good against evil. To a quest few are prepared for, and fewer still survive. But perhaps now the power is within your grasp. It's the game that's already a legend. The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. Only on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with superpower.
So here's the 360 tour of the Super Nintendo here, guys. So as you guys can see, this is top of the system. So here's the power button, power on, power off. This is reset. This is where you put your cartridge in. All right, guys, and I forgot about the eject button. I caught that during editing. So here's the eject button. You just push it, pops your cartridges out. Player 1, player 2 for your controls. Your power LED, the chips that are on the corners of mine because it's yellow and brittle and that's the way it is. On the sides, nothing but molded plastic really. In the back here, this is where you plug in your AV cable right here. This is your RF out, your channel select, and this is where your power adapter goes right here. And if you have problems with this, you can call Nintendo and you can get some warranty work. You know how that works. In the bottom here, just molded plastic. Then you have the expansion port that would have plugged into, say, that PlayStation disc thing that was supposed to come out that never did. And here's the controller for it, guys. So really, this is like the standard controller that exists nowadays. I mean, you have your D-pad here, select start, your buttons there, and then your shoulder buttons. Love these shoulder buttons. But really, to tell you the truth, does that look familiar, guys? Because that's really what this is. Sony really just took the Super Nintendo controller and turned it into their own. So, and it's been a successful design ever since, really. All right, guys. Well, let's go ahead and power this thing on and do some gameplay.
Decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing feeling. When you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come, the games of Super Nintendo. No one else creates this kind of experience, because no one else creates these kinds of games. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
Introducing the next generation from Nintendo, New Super Mario World, created especially for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It's a bit more exciting, a bit more challenging, a bit more graphic, a bit more colorful, a bit more realistic, a bit more levels, a bit more secret, a bit more enemies, a bit more friends, a bit more sound, a bit hotter, a bit cooler, a bit weird, a bit more revolutionary, a bit more Mario, a bit more of what you want. It's 16-bit, and it's yours only if you get New Super Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
All right, guys, we've come to the end of the video where I give my thoughts and opinions about the system itself. And what more can I say about the Super Nintendo over there? I mean, it was just a great system. The sales figures don't lie. It was very popular. But by the time it came out, I had already owned a Sega Genesis. And I was already really into Sega. I already had a few Sega games in my library. And my parents bought this for me, I think the Christmas of '91 was when I got my Super Nintendo. And, you know, I played like Super Mario World and Donkey Kong Country and that kind of thing on it. But what I really enjoyed on the Super Nintendo was the sports games, honestly. The controller and the controls for them was just so much better with the shoulder, buttons. That's what I really liked about the system. So I played all this, really the sports games on that, except for driving games. I ended up playing on the Sega Genesis more. But like football, basketball, all that kind of stuff, hockey, all that, I actually played on the Super Nintendo a lot more than I did on the Genesis, to tell you the truth. And it really shows, because that whole controller scheme, that Super Nintendo, what do they call that? The bone controller. It kind of went on to go into the design of the PlayStation controller, which turned into, Xbox has kind of got the same type of controller as well, just the analog stick and the D-pad switched around, that type of thing. So really that same control is still around to this day. So Nintendo, I got to give them props for that. They're the one that started that. And that's why I like the sports games better on the Super Nintendo. So really, that's my thoughts and opinions about it. I mean, I had friends that had both systems. Everybody played them. And well into like the mid, almost late 90s, people were still playing these systems. So, well, anyway, guys, I'm going to go ahead and head out of here. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. If you like the content, go ahead and hit like. And don't forget to hit that bell above as well. That way you get notifications every time I drop new content. Alrighty, y'all. I'm going to get out of here. Peace out.
Game over, man. It's game over.